is Neil Emerick, and I am a libertarian, so we'll clear that up. This subject, I think, is something that I haven't looked at deeply until I thought about presenting here at the Libertarian Conference. So it's something I sort of researched and needed to think about. It's a challenging subject and a difficult one. But I wanted to have a look at it because it's about race, and race is a very difficult subject in this country. And so I thought, let's explore this. And it's also, I wanted to look at black economic empowerment from the point of view of an ethical principle, rather than a sort of efficacy. So that's the view I'll be taking as we go through this. First, we'll define what black economic empowerment is. So it is a policy of government, a law that attempts to use race as a metric for achieving certain outcomes. It uses government procurement and transformation charters to achieve a certain social end. And the goal here is the transfer or the alteration within society of ownership patterns. And with black economic empowerment particularly, we're also talking about management control within companies and skills development and also enterprise development. Now, the law draws its foundation from the Constitution, and particularly Section 9. This is the Equality Clause. And there are the two really important points here. You can turn around without seeing it. Here we go, calm it down. Section 1 says everybody's equal before the law. 3 and 4 state that we are not allowed to discriminate based on these grounds, principally race in this case. But Section 2 is the challenging one, because this one says that the government is free to make laws that do discriminate on race if it achieves equality. So we have a contradiction here between the no discrimination and certain discrimination may be allowed if it may deal with unfair discrimination of the past. The broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Act is actually the legislation that is used to implement BEE in this country. If you read the goals there, they sound quite laudable. We want to promote the achievement of the right to equality and increase participation of black people in the economy. Who doesn't want that? And to establish a national policy to promote economic unity of the nation. These are the stated goals of the legislation. There are then 7 objectives listed at the beginning of the Act, and you might want to work your way through there, but just to summarise, the 6 of them use the words promotion and increasing the extent, promoting investment, empowering, which doesn't use race, by the way. This one, empowering rural and local communities, could be anybody. Everything else uses race as a metric for promoting and increasing transformation within the economy. Now, I think before I go further, we need to just address the question of whether we feel that redress is required. Now, what I did here was I just did a simple Excel spreadsheet where I said, given an exact starting point for 2 groups of people, if the one was to progress at a 5% wealth accumulation each year, but one other group was on a hiatus for 25 years, there was literally, their wealth did not increase for 25 years, where would you then be? Now, at a 5% annual increase, the first group ends up 4 times richer than the other group within 25 years. And if it's 10%, it's 11 times richer. And what's even harder is then to say, right, well, how do you bring those 2 groups back together again? What interest rates do you need to sort of set? And you have to set the secondary group at what, 40% or 35% increase over the other people for 75 years just to get back to parity. So that's the maths of it. That's quite hard. Now, I saw this survey about a year ago, and I did find it fascinating. It was done in the UK by a couple of researchers called Clark and Cummings, and they were interested in social mobility and the sort of friction between generations and the accumulation of wealth. So what are the chances that the son will be as wealthy or have the same income level as the father? And what was interesting was that they had assumed there was the social mobility would have quite a low coefficient between, pointing between sort of father and son. But what they discovered was that some of the Norman names like Percy and Montgomery and Darcy, actually had a tremendous carryover in generational power. And it was much more than a correlation of a sort of 0.2 to 0.4. It was closer to sort of 0.9, which means over 600 years before a surname will revert to the mean. They actually used surnames as their way of measuring generational wealth. And they were able to tap into databases that go back to the 1300s in the UK. And they used, at Oxford University, they were using probate records to monitor wealth and also the prominence of certain surnames in political elite. So it took nearly 600, 700 years before some of those names actually reverted to the mean. So it does show that there's a tremendous amount of friction in once wealth is accumulated for it to then dissipate and revert to the mean. So this gap is real, and I want to just acknowledge that, you know, in terms of my understanding of the subject, I don't mean to underestimate what it is to be a black South African and what it is collectively to have been held back by the law. That is a reality. Now, I refer to Leon in terms of understanding some of this. I think we also can recognise that there were historically disadvantaged people. Not necessarily to say that the other group was necessarily promoted or advantaged. I think the interpretation I remember from Leon was that white South Africans continued with freedom and capitalism. What blacks had to suffer in South Africa was socialism, in the sense that they weren't allowed to own property freely, they weren't allowed to work or choose where they wanted to be, and so it's that which was lifted. But that's what we're addressing, and that's what we say needs to be addressed. The bigger question then, though, is should the state be the one to promote and increase this economic participation of black South Africans? So now we move into the ethical area, and where we go, we need to move from the is to the ought, and this is the mechanism by which I want to evaluate black economic empowerment today. So Hume made the question of, you know, is doesn't necessarily, ought does not necessarily follow from is unless there's a really good reason. So that's what we want to explore. Is there a really good reason for saying that we should transform and use the government to redress these historical imbalances? Now, you've got two choices ethically in terms of a framework that you can use to address the problem or to understand the problem. So the first method that I'm going to suggest here is what they call consequentialism. This is where the end justifies the means, and we have subsets of this, the utilitarianism that you'll be familiar with. So we'll be looking at where the greatest outcome for the greatest number. But consequentialism can also lead to some bizarre things where you might decide to execute somebody and harvest their organs in order to help 5 other people. So there are some boundaries there which you need to monitor. The other way of justifying an ethical position is the deontological. So this is where you have a firm principle in mind that you can evaluate and equate to being either right or wrong. So that can be more helpful sometimes, where the means do not justify the ends. You start with the ends and say, right, let's evaluate this on a given principle. So to explore a few philosophers who have mined these laws, let's start with Immanuel Kant. So he came up with the categorical imperative that asked us to say, using our rationality, our pure minds, would we come up with a law that everybody would universally agree with, irrespective of our position in the world? So that's one way we can evaluate black economic empowerment and say, is this a policy that we could rationally agree with, and everybody would say that makes sense for us to use this to redress the ills of the past. Now, similar, but appealing to a different human attribute, was Hume, who said, now you can't use rationality, you've got to use the morality of your passions. Are you sympathetic to the cause that's been offered to you? Do you understand? And in this framework, then, we would appreciate be from a sympathetic point of view. And so, is this something we should do because it's the right thing to do? Adam Smith, famous for Wealth of Nations, but also wrote a book on morality, the theory of moral sentiments. And he posed a slightly different route to understanding how we arrived at our morality, which was the concept of the impartial spectator. So he put an angel on your shoulder, and in a sense it's an interesting sense of morality, because it's deontological in the sense it asks you to judge whether something is right or wrong, but it's not really asking you to judge it. It's asking you to second guess the angel on your shoulder and say, well, if I were being watched, would I behave in this manner? So it's a little bit of a, I think, a degraded morality in some respects, because it's not asking you to judge for yourself, but asking what you think others would judge of you. My wife will laugh at this one. She always thought that Hegel's dialectic was an ailment that the grandmother would have. But Hegel came up with the concept of the master and slave, and proposed sort of this contrast between the lord and the slave, and that they would find identity in these roles as they expanded them and they became self-conscious, but it would lead to its own contradiction. And the slave would be the one responsible for making all the stuff for the Lord, and in doing that they would find their own purpose and so on, and then there would be this synthesis and conflict, and how it would resolve was the dialectic. Then we have John Rawls, who put forward a very comprehensive theory of distributive justice. So he was interested in justice as fairness, and although he conceded the difference principle, which said that you could have inequality in society if no one would be worse off from making any change. But in essence, he was putting forward a very liberal philosophy of justifying transfers across society to create equality as fairness. Now that was contrasted by Nozick, who said that no, it's not about the outcome there, it's about how the distribution within society is arrived at. Now, if we consider South Africa from a Nozickian position, we have to say that today's social outcome is one arrived at unfairly. Okay? There were laws in place that have caused a distribution of property that is unfair. The bigger question then, using Nozick's framework, would be, can we move from that position to a new position in such a way that is just? If transfers between people are just, and then the final outcome, even if it creates inequalities, is a just one. Jeremy Bentham was a legal positivist, a utilitarian, and said, this is all nonsense, Neil. Law is law and morality is morality, and don't confuse the two. And he called it to derive laws derived from natural rights, which is common theme here. He called nonsense on stilts. So from Bentham's position, he said that law itself could only be just if it was justly created, but the law itself could not be judged as being moral or amoral. So from that point of view, black economic empowerment is a moral law because it's been justly legislated by a just democratic parliament. And one other moral framework we might look at things as is from a sort of a game theoretic point of view. It's an amoral morality in the sense that if we can get away with it, we could. This is called a sort of a moral constraint maximizer. You have to work within the society that you're given. If you don't like black economic empowerment, well then you could consider fronting and just bend the rules a little bit and take the consequences that are. So that's another approach we might take. Now, again, to evaluate black economic empowerment from a moral point of view, we should ask the question as well, is that the only form of redress that we need to look at in South Africa? Clearly black South Africans were affected, but it should be remembered that white women didn't have the vote until 1930, and they didn't have the right to be directors and own property and so on without their husband's consent until 1994. So 50% of our population, at least, as well, were also held back economically, and we potentially should be worrying about those issues of redress as well. Black economic empowerment doesn't have a monopoly on the redress issue. I would also ask the question, how guilty is a young white South African born today who does face the laws that are presented? In fact, I go a little bit further back and say that anybody, a white South African born after 1976, when they had no ability to vote in the apartheid government, how guilty are they that they should receive or suffer in some sense any economic hardship under these laws. So that is a moral position as well, whether that should be allowed. And then that's a perspective from a white perspective. Let's consider a black perspective. We understand black economic empowerment to be a transfer of ownership. We also understand that it's a procurement program. Necessarily, there is a premium being paid for the government services that they buy. If we, knowing that there are trade-offs, if we are paying a premium at one end, necessarily the people who are the recipients of those services are getting a raw deal. We have to evaluate the morality of making some people wealthy at the expense of others, which are typically going to be black South Africans. We should also consider what it means to tell foreign investors that they can't invest here fully and that they have to share their ownership or equity or practices or so on with other people based on their race. And I also find it hard to come to terms with the fact that we are turning investors away because we want the racial composition to their investments. And again, we look at who it is that suffers. If we think about Starlink and Elon Musk, what could we have if we had full internet across rural South Africa? And what benefits would that bring? And I think we have to add that into the mix when we're weighing up these policies. And the act itself and the impact it has on economic and entrepreneurial thinking. I don't know that we can say that the growth that we've suffered in anything is unrelated to some of the policies that have been chosen that are racially based. You know, we've had poor economic growth, and again, that poor economic growth has had an impact on black South Africans who are predominantly the unemployed ones. It has affected the economic environment that we're operating in. And we should also understand the corruption of the society. What does it mean for us to have these billionaires having that level of wealth that was clearly arrived at from political connections rather than any sense of economic merit? And William Gumedi, famously wrote an article that Vivian reported on that over R1 trillion has been transferred in society, but to about 100 people. Now, backing those or finding that statistics hard, but I mean, we know that there are very, very dominant players who are politically connected who have benefited from this transformation that the legislation proposes to offer. So in summary, last year I was asked to speak on immigration, and I didn't know which way I was going to go. I am an immigrant, clearly, from the accent, and but I also understand the libertarian position to put big walls up and not let whoever you want come in. So I like open borders, but I also respect high walls. I ended my talk last year just neutrally. I had said I didn't know which way to go, but I felt that was a little unsatisfactory. So this year I'm going to pin my thing to the mast and say, no, BEE, I don't like it. It's an issue. It's an issue that we can all deal with in the ways that we do when we go home, in whichever form you make your protest. But I think we should think about attacking BEE from an ethical position, which is hard. We acknowledge the wrongs of the past, but we have to understand these new processes and whether they themselves pass an ethical test. And I don't think BEE does. Racial patronage there can't be anything other than corrupt, but also we can look at it not just from its efficiency as a transformation exercise, but whether it's a correct transformation process. I mentioned the Constitution right at the beginning, and I think it's worthwhile to go back to the Constitution. On the one side, we have equality. It's equality before the law for everybody, and that I think we're all respectful from 1994. On the other side, though, we have the concept of a founding principle of the Constitution, which is dignity. And equality and dignity are both listed sort of rights that are there offered in the Constitution. However, I think that dignity ranks higher than equality. It is a founding principle. It's in Section 1. Equality comes in Section 9. Dignity is a justiciable right, and the courts have actually found in favour where equality and dignity were in conflict. The courts have actually erred on the side of dignity, which is interesting. I think dignity remains one of the most important ethical foundations for this test. I think black economic empowerment makes white people feel unwelcome in their own country. And I think, as it was mentioned yesterday, I think systems that are not based on merit but based on skin colour create a burden of doubt on young black professionals who just wonder, am I really here for the right reasons? That is dignity. And I don't think we can equate equality, which is a tool, where dignity is a goal, it's a value. In summary, I think we could make other choices in terms of achieving the ends that have been stated, which is transformation of the South African economy. I think we can agree that we want to see a more just society, justly arrived at, but I don't think that using race as a metric for that transformational process is the correct one. It is divisive, it is costly, it is corrupting, and I don't think it leads us to the society that we want to live in.